So we're in the Gospel of Matthew. We're in the Gospel of Matthew. We're talking about discipleship. We're going through the Discipleship Narratives. And last week, we were in chapter 8. Last week we saw the scene. We had this scene where Jesus had these conversations, two conversations with two people, really in the process or in the midst of trying to escape, trying to get away from some crowds that were really starting to grow up and develop and swell around him. And he was on his way down to the lake. He was going down to the lake, he and his disciples, 4 of them at that point, trying to get away from these crowds. They were going to go down to the lake, get in a boat, and take off and hightail it to the other side of the Sea of Galilee when all of a sudden they were caught by these two, a scribe and then a disciple, asking, what does discipleship mean? I want to be your disciple. They both said this, I want to be your disciple. What does that mean? What do I need to do? What does that look like? And the answers and responses that Jesus gave were hard answers, hard responses to swallow. It's a high calling to be a disciple of Jesus. It's hard work. And he doesn't compromise on that in any way. So Jesus and his disciples, they take off, they go across the lake, they go over to a place, a region that's kind of referred to sometimes as Gad. The region of Gad is just kind of a funny name, but that's just what they would give some places at some time. It's on the opposite side. I thought my cough was gone. Now all of a sudden I get to start talking and start all up again. So they go over to Gad, and they're over there. Jesus does a few more miraculous healings. He casts out a few demons, and after a while, after a little bit, a few days, it kind of seems like, they get back in the boat, and they come back over to Capernaum. And then when he gets back to Capernaum, he rounds up, he invites, he calls another disciple, a new disciple, the 5th one that we have in the Gospel of Matthew. Let's pray a second, then we're going to go ahead and take a look at Matthew chapter 9. Heavenly Father, Lord, pray that you open our ears, open our hearts, and open our minds, Lord, that we may hear and we may understand, that we may be transformed and moved and challenged and encouraged by your word this morning, Lord. That we may be moved to become increasingly more like your Son in the way we interact and the way we live. In Jesus' name, amen. So Matthew chapter 9 is where we're at this morning. Matthew chapter 9, I'm going to begin reading at verse 9. So as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. Now while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? I'm going to stop there for a second. We'll pick up here in a few minutes back with them. I'm going to stop there. So Jesus is on his way into town. They've gotten back over to the Capernaum side of the Sea of Galilee. And as soon as they get off the boat, there's probably somebody already watching, just kind of happened to notice, look, here comes Jesus and his disciples. They're coming back. And as soon as he steps off the boat and steps on the dry land, we have the scene where some more people bring yet more people who need healing to Jesus. And so Jesus heals some more people, does some more healing. And then he goes on from there, and he's heading into the town of Capernaum himself. And when he gets to Capernaum, he runs into this man by the name of Matthew. This man by the name of Matthew, who's a tax collector. Tax collectors were extremely wealthy. I keep talking about this. It's sort of like you almost see kind of this progression that happens throughout the gospel. Every time Jesus has a significant conversation about discipleship with somebody, it seems like that person, their economic status just keeps growing and climbing higher and higher and higher. First was the fishermen, fairly solid, economic kind of situation that they were in, fairly solid career. And then from there it became a scribe, which we saw last week, who was one of the more higher class, one of the more wealthy people in town, perhaps maybe even the wealthiest person in Capernaum all the way around. Now we have a tax collector who would have been right there in the same category as the scribe he talked to last week. Tax collectors were wealthy, but they weren't wealthy because of their work ethic. They weren't wealthy because they had a lot of money that they just kind of inherited. They weren't wealthy necessarily even because of their social standing. They definitely weren't wealthy because they were hardworking. Tax collectors worked for the Roman army. or the Roman government, I should say. They worked for the enemy, and they were usually Israelites, and so there was a sense when you looked at a tax collector, when the people looked at a tax collector, they saw somebody who was, in many ways, they basically looked at him as a traitor. This was somebody who didn't understand. They weren't faithful. They weren't loyal to their own people. This was somebody who had been hired by Rome or had agreed to work for Rome in order to collect money from the Israelites in order to fund the occupation of an enemy army. This was a big deal. This was a problem. This was a problem for most people. And now, I'm going to point something out here about tax collectors that you probably skipped over, not because you're unobservant, because it's just kind of one of those things we tend to skip over. Take a look at verse 10 again here a second. Many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him. And then down in verse 11, when the Pharisees go and talk to the disciples, and they're talking to the disciples, they say, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" So there's twice in these verses, twice in this passage, there's a distinction that's being made between tax collectors and sinners. So tax collectors were bad, sinners were bad, tax collectors were bad, but tax collectors were in a whole nother category of bad for these people. In fact, a tax collector would actually aspire to become a sinner. Now, how weird does that sound? I mean, how many of us oftentimes go around thinking, man, I really want to be a sinner? I mean, we don't think that way. We're kind of taught, sinning is bad. Being a sinner is a bad thing. You don't want to be a sinner. Be a tax collector in first century Capernaum, you wanted to be a sinner because you were looked at more positively as a sinner than you were as a tax collector. Tax collectors, they were the scum of society. They were the bottom feeders, despite their wealth. This was because of that status and that reputation that they had for being traitors to their own people. So what a tax collector would do, so their job, what a daily routine of a tax collector would look like. Tax collector would sit at the city gate. So as you're coming into town, as you're coming through the gate, the main entrance to the town, the main road, you would have a tax collector's booth sitting there where the tax collector would be. And everybody who came in that town, everybody who went through that gate, who wanted to do business of some sort in that town, would have to stop at that tax collector's booth and pay a certain tax, basically like a sales tax that was imposed upon them by Rome. And this was determined by, you go and you talk to them, you say, this is what I'm here for, this is what I want to do, this is how much, business I'm going to do, how much money I'm planning on making, and then you would have this estimated tax. Well, it was all based on what do you anticipate possibly doing when you're in that town. And of course, Rome wants to make as much money as they can. So they're always going to estimate high, and you have to pay this tax up front before you've actually even made any money. There's a whole bunch of uncertainty going on here. Now, tax collectors like Matthew figured out very early on that they could take advantage of this system. They could start using this system for their own personal gain. And so while the people around didn't know what the tax rate actually was, these tax collectors would then set their own tax rate that would be higher than what Rome said they had to do. And then they would take the extra money that they got, they'd pocket it, and they'd use it to their profit. And they'd get rich off of it. So everybody recognized, and they looked at tax collectors as, this is somebody who's they're stealing from me. They're taking advantage of me. They are intentionally robbing me. I can't prove it. I don't know exactly how much Rome is taking from them, but man, these people are rich, and I know they're hiking the fees, and I know they're taking my money. They're hurting me, and they're hurting my family. So Jesus has gone his way into town with his disciples. They come up to the gate. They come up to the main gate, to the main entrance of Capernaum, and they see Matthew sitting there. And Jesus says, "Matthew, follow me. Follow me." Now, who's with Jesus? The disciples. Peter, Andrew, James, John. That's who we know about so far in this gospel. What did Peter, Andrew, James, and John do? Where did they live? They lived in Capernaum. So they're in their own hometown. What did they do for a living? They were fishermen. So every night they would go out, they would catch their fish, they would bring their fish back into town, looking to sell their fish that they caught that night at the local Capernaum farmers market later that day. But what do they have to do before they get there? They have to stop at the tax booth and pay tax on what they hope they can sell. Now, Capernaum wasn't a very big town. 1,500 people, maybe, max. maybe that big. A couple tax collectors, but it's sort of like you think about, if you go to Starbucks every day, you have a number of people, you're not going to see the same employees every day. You might be different employees, but over time, you're going to get to know basically everybody who's there. I used to have it when I was in seminary. I used to have a Starbucks that I went into. All I had to do was walk in the door, set my computer down, and get my books out, and as soon as the barista saw me walk in, bam, they were making my drink. I didn't even have to go to the counter. It was great. They would just let me know when it was done. I go up and I pay and I walk away. I mean, it was perfect. You kind of get into that relationship with certain people. Well, Capernaum's not very big. You're going to have maybe 3, maybe 4 tax collectors at most. You only have maybe 2 entrances into town. And before the disciples have to get into town to actually sell their fish, they have to stop at the tax booth and pay a tax. Who are they paying it to? Matthew. 4 out of the 5 disciples have serious personal issues with Matthew. They know that he's robbed them. They know he's taken advantage of him. And now here's Jesus saying, Matthew, come along, join us. 4 out of the 5 disciples now have to look at the 5th disciple, and they have to accept him as completely equal to them. They have to love him. They have to treat them as normal. They have to welcome him in despite what he has done to take advantage and steal from them. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to hear that conversation. I mean, you could just imagine the sort of stuff that would have been going on there. Probably, my guess is all 4 of those disciples, they probably would have been like, okay, this Jesus guy, he's whack, he's crazy, we're done. We're home, we're just going to go home, we're not coming out, we're not going to talk to this guy anymore. That's not what they did. I don't know why, that's what I would have done, but that's not what they did. So Jesus invites Matthew into this relationship, into this discipleship relationship with him. And then they go on a little bit further. Verse 12. Actually, I'm getting all mixed up now. What am I doing here? Verse 12. Let's just go with verse 12. On hearing this, Jesus said, actually, I'm not going to skip that. I'm getting all mixed up. Man, alive here. All right. So Jesus invites these disciples in. He invites Matthew in, and then he and the disciples, Jesus and the disciples, they go over to Matthew's house, and they have dinner with all of Matthew's tax collector friends and other sinners. Now, the Pharisees are looking at this, and they pull the disciples aside, and they say, disciples, what's this Jesus guy doing? What's he doing? Do you realize what he's doing? Do you realize the problem here? And now the reason why the Pharisees would do that and what's going through the Pharisees' mind is that, one, Jesus as a rabbi is now putting himself in a situation that makes him ceremonially unclean. And that was a big deal for the Pharisees. So the Pharisees were really all about this whole idea, we got to stay pure. We have to stay righteous. We have to stay clean. We can't interact and mingle with these sinners and even worse, tax collectors. We can't do that. And so the Pharisees are pulling the disciples aside, and my guess is that the disciples don't even know exactly how to answer this question. They're looking at the Pharisees and like, we have no idea what Jesus is doing here. All right, we're just as confused as you. Then Jesus overhears them, and then that's where Jesus butts in. That's where we get to verse 12. On hearing this, Jesus said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come to call the righteous, but not the sinners. So the Pharisees, yep, it is backwards. I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners. I'm going to get there. Man, alive. This is a rough day for me. I am. I'm making sure y'all are paying attention. That's what it is. Y'all are keeping me on my toes today. So, Jesus interjects. He interjects and he answers the Pharisees' questions. He says, this is what I'm doing. And he starts talking about a doctor. But who said anything about a doctor here, right? I mean, all of a sudden, Jesus is talking about a doctor, and we get it. It's kind of this illustration, this picture, this kind of almost a parable of sorts for what Jesus is actually trying to get at. He's speaking the Pharisees' language here. And it's all about trying to get to that big point of where he really wants to go and the message he's really making and everything that even Matthew's own calling into discipleship represents. He's getting at this point, this idea of mercy, the centrality of mercy. See, the Pharisees, like I said, the Pharisees don't like this. They don't like what they're seeing. They disagree with it. They think that Jesus is making a huge mistake by hanging out and talking with these people and having dinner with these people. And they can't understand for the life of them why it is that Jesus is doing what he's doing, but he's speaking their language. So the Pharisees have this idea They have this idea, just kind of talk about that last part of verse 13 for a second here. Pharisees have this idea that righteousness comes before salvation. A person has to be righteous before they can be saved. A person has to actually kind of go through these motions, go through the hard work, get themselves to a point of being right with God, right with the law, before God will even look at them and allow them to enter into his presence, to join in that messianic banquet that I've referred to a couple of times here and there over the last while that I've been here. The Pharisees believe that the person has to do hard work to get saved. A sinner cannot be saved. A sinner doesn't want, God doesn't want anything to do with sinners. The doctor piece of it comes into play, with still connected to this mercy thing. The doctor piece comes into it because in the Pharisees' mind, if you're not righteous or if you're not healthy, I'm not going to waste my time trying to help you be healthy or help you be righteous. See, that the sick person, somebody who can't be healthy on their own, isn't worth your effort. They don't care. And that's the way that they look at these tax collectors, these sinners. They're sick. They're not healthy. They're unrighteous. God doesn't want anything to do with them. I'm not going to waste my time with them. And Jesus comes along and he says there at the end of verse 13, he says, "For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." In the Pharisees' mind, this is heresy. This is heresy. This is wrong. It's not the way it's supposed to be. Jesus is completely flipping this around, and he's spouting nothing short of heresy, and some of the worst heresy at that. So there's two commands that come out in our text that when you put them together, basically help us get to the meat and the core of what's going on in this scene. And that first command comes in verse 9. The command to follow, which we become familiar with, that basic call to follow Jesus as disciples into discipleship. That second command, comes up in verse 12. Go and learn what this means. When we look at this scene, when we think about what is Matthew trying to tell us here about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, we put those two commands together to get this message of follow Jesus and learn. Follow Jesus and learn. But what are we learning? What are we learning? And that's where that next part comes in then. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. So Jesus quotes Hosea chapter 6, verse 6 here. Brief rundown of Hosea. Hosea is one of the minor prophets from the Old Testament. Fascinating book. Incredibly fascinating book. The context that's set up there is God tells the prophet Hosea to go and marry a temple prostitute and then start having kids with her. And then the marriage and the wife and the kids and this whole picture is intended to be sort of like this living example of Israel's unfaithfulness toward God. It's this sort of really weird kind of performance art thing like you might see from, UC Berkeley student group or something, where they go out onto the street or a public area and they do something weird that nobody understands to make some sort of political statement that nobody understands. It was the same basic thing that went on with Hosea. Interesting, fascinating. We're going to preach on it one of these days. We're going to take a look at it. But that's sort of the context that comes into play there. And in the midst of that is this verse from Hosea chapter 6. It's one verse, and Jesus doesn't say the whole verse. He only says part of it, but he says that because the Pharisees, nobody's getting it. Let me read that verse out of Hosea a second. Hosea 6:6, the full verse. For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. Desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. Now Israel, back in Hosea's day, Israel forgot about God. In many ways, they actually forgot about God. They forgot about God. And they replaced him with tradition. If I can be fair and if I can be honest a second, we have a tendency to do the same thing. I was just talking with another pastor friend of mine earlier this week, and he was saying that in his last call, in his last position before moving here, he had a number of people who frequently came up to him and said, Mark, you got to keep talking about this stuff. Don't worry about being repetitious. Don't worry about getting annoying with the repetition, because we forget. We space out. We zone zone out. We get distracted, even just sitting in church, and we get distracted from week to week. We forget about God. We forget about who we are and what we've been called to do. And Israel had a tendency and went through this pattern throughout the Old Testament of constantly forgetting about God and replacing him with something else, replacing him with tradition. And the tradition that Hosea is speaking to and that Jesus is getting at and the Pharisees are getting locked into is this tradition of the sacrificial system. With something that takes up a whole bunch of the Old Testament with the animals and the temple stuff and the rituals, and it's a whole bunch of stuff that none of us ever want to read, but it's all there. And they got locked into this idea of thinking that the sacrifices was what mattered. It was what mattered, what the sacrifice was, just simply going through the motions and doing the sacrifices rather than getting at something else, getting at the reason for why those sacrifices existed. And here in Hosea, God through Hosea says, look, Israel, look, my people, you don't get it. You're not understanding it. I don't care about the sacrifices. I don't give a rip about the burnt offerings. What I care about is mercy and acknowledgement of God. Tradition. I don't want to pick on tradition too much. I actually kind of sit right in the line, right in the middle with tradition and all things tradition. Tradition becomes tradition for good reason, right? I mean, think about that for a second. The reason why something becomes tradition to begin with is usually for good reason. Tradition, it roots us, it grounds us, it connects us with some sort of a deep truth in an odd sort of a way by going through motions and practicing various forms of tradition in our churches or in our life or in the world and in our community. We are connected to those who have both come before us in the past and those who are coming after us in the future. We're connected in this weird sort of way that transcends time and place and people and culture by carrying out and practicing things of tradition. But it's really easy for traditions for us to forget about why the tradition exists to begin with. It's really easy for us to get about what the meaning is and what's really behind that and why it became tradition in the first place. After a while, when you go through tradition, the good part about tradition is that going through it can almost become second nature. You think about if you've ever learned an instrument. You learn an instrument. You know, most of you now know that I play piano, and so I've spent a lot of time playing piano and learning piano. There's a tradition piece in which your fingers just sort of learn which keys to play at what time and what tempo and at what volume. And so it gets to the point where you can get lost in the music because you just sort of do it without even thinking about it. And in many ways, that becomes a good thing because you as the pianist can now, as the musician, can now come to appreciate the music that you yourself are playing. But on the other side, on the flip side, in our own church history, in our own church tradition, many of our churches have 2 services on Sunday, a morning and an evening service. Nothing wrong with that. There's a reason why we have 2 services. There's a theological reason that sits behind that. But as part of the evening service, one of the aspects of the evening service in a traditional evening service is that we always read the 10 Commandments. That came out of something. But over time, you start to forget, why are the 10 Commandments being read every single week? Why do I have to sit here every week and be in many ways kind of beat over the head with the 10 Commandments and feeling guilty and feeling judged because of it? Where does that come from? What's the point of that? And so the 10 Commandments started getting dropped from some of our services. And then after a while, some of our churches started dropping the Sunday evening service altogether. I'm not making an argument to go back to that, just so you know. Don't get too worried and too worked up about this. But we forget about why these things began and were established to begin with. And some people just kind of said, hey, great, now we don't have to go to church twice. We only have to go to church once on Sunday. Now we don't have to worry about the 10 Commandments anymore. Some people said, man, I really wish we still had that evening service. And this is why, and they have good reasons. I wish we still had the 10 Commandments, and this is why, and they were good reasons. And some people said, I'm upset because we don't have an evening service or 10 Commandments, and gosh, God, I don't know why we don't have them, but we ought to have them because that's the way it always used to be. We forget about why we do these things and why tradition becomes tradition. And we start to think of the tradition as being the important thing, the thing in itself that matters. And the Pharisees got locked into that same thinking. And now here's Jesus saying, look, you guys don't get it. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Acknowledgement of me, not burnt offerings. make things a little more complex here. Another twist. This translation for mercy in our text in Matthew, mercy is a bad word. It's a bad translation. I got to say that. And it's because the Hebrew word that's actually there and being used in Hosea is a Hebrew word that is so complex and so big, mercy just doesn't really cut it. Using the word mercy to translate that is a little bit like the translators dropping back into tradition and going with what we all know and what's familiar. It's the Hebrew word chesed, which I've talked about before. I can actually do that. I don't have laryngitis anymore, so I can say chesed, clear your throat, that good guttural sound there. Sounds like you're hawking loogies on everybody. Chesed. It's kind of historically been thought of as, or translated or understood as, loving kindness. It's a core, fundamental attribute and characteristic of God. It's one of the most protected attributes that God has of himself. He will not allow his chesed to be compromised or to be done away with or forgotten or ignored. He will make sure that that is never forgotten, that is never missed. And even though it's so important to who God is, this chesed, it's something that we see in Matthew 9 that Jesus expects his disciples to adopt, to receive, to practice, and to have as their own. It is a way in which disciples then, as this definition I've been using, discipleship is this ongoing process of becoming continually more Jesus-like. It is a way in which we become more Jesus-like. To practice chesed in our own life. We look at Matthew, we look at who he is, we look at the relationship he had to the disciples, we look at the Pharisees complaining that Jesus is eating with these, we look at Jesus' response in saying that you don't have to be righteous, you have to be a sinner and acknowledge that sin in order to be saved. That's chesed at work in this text, and he's teaching his disciples what that looks like and how that is played out. Without chesed, there is no cross. There is no resurrection. There is no promise of salvation. Without chesed, a tax collector isn't invited to follow Jesus. Without chesed, 4 disciples who have been cheated out of thousands of shekels cannot fully accept and forgive the man who cheated them. Without chesed, the sick are not made well. See, the opportunities to practice chesed in our own lives, they show themselves every single day. Everything from dealing with difficult kids, which I know never happens in your house, to the gossipy coworker, to the person who cut you off during your morning commute. Chesed is how we conduct ourselves in our marriages and our friendships and how we interact and relate to one another. Beyond that is how we conduct ourselves, or beyond that is, as Jesus has shown us, is that it is something for us to practice. Chesed is even for those who we don't think are worth it. And perhaps even for good reason. It's to love the unlovable. It involves the excruciatingly difficult work of forgiving when forgiveness is never asked for, and reconciliation when the other person doesn't want it, and where it's far easier to just sweep it under the rug and forget that it ever happened to begin with. The difficulty with a word like chesed is that it simply cannot be put into words. It's to be experienced in so many ways, just the way that Matthew experienced it in Matthew 9. It's the feeling and knowledge you suddenly have at that moment that God's grace becomes tangible for you, that you realize just how desperate you are for it, and that the grace that you have actually received, that you don't deserve it, and yet inexplicably it's become yours. And then we turn around and we share that with others. Something akin to the Dutch word gezellig, and I don't even know if I even pronounced that one right. But hopefully enough of you know what I'm talking about when I say gezellig. Or the Indian word, maybe you've heard this one, the Indian word namaste. It's a full, all-encompassing word that reaches and speaks into every single part of you. It's a peace, a satisfaction, a comfort that cannot be put into words. It just is. It's mercy. It's love. It's peace. It's compassion. It's grace. And it's all of the above. It's the driving force behind biblical justice. It's at the very core of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. This chesed. Let's pray.